Ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt was a civilization of ancient northeastern Africa, concentrated along the lower reaches of the Nile River in the place that is now the country Egypt. It is one of the 6 historic civilizations to arise independently. Egyptian civilization followed prehistoric Egypt and coalesced around 3100 BC. With political unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under Menes. The history of ancient Egypt occurred as a series of stable kingdoms separated by periods of relative instability known as intermediate periods: the Old Kingdom of the Early Bronze Age, the Middle Kingdom of Middle Bronze Age, and the New Kingdom of the Late Bronze Age. Egypt reached the pinnacle of its power in the New Kingdom, ruling much of Nubia and a sizable portion of the Near East, after which it entered a period of slow decline. Egypt was invaded or conquered by succession of foreign powers such as Hyksos, Libyans, the Nubians, the Assyrians, and Achaemenids, Persians, and the Macedonians in the Third Intermediate and Late periods. The Greek Polemic Kingdom, formed in the aftermath of Alexander the Great's death, ruled Egypt until 30 BC, when under Cleopatra it fell to the Roman Empire and became a Roman province. The success of ancient Egyptian civilization came partly from its ability to adapt to the conditions of the Nile River Valley for agriculture. The predictive flooding and controlled irrigation of the fertile valley produced surplus crops which supported a more dense population and social development and culture, with resources to spare the administration-sponsored mineral exploitation of the valley and surrounding desert regions. The early development in independent writing system, the organization of collective construction, agricultural project, trade with surrounding regions, and the military intended to defeat foreign enemies and assert Egyptian dominance. Motivating and organizing these activities was a bureaucracy of elite scribes, religious leaders, and administrators under the control of a pharaoh, who ensured the cooperation and unity of Egyptian people in context of an elaborate system of religious beliefs. The many achievements of the ancient Egyptians include quarrying, surveying, and construction techniques that supported the buildings of monumental pyramids, temples, obelisks, and a system of mathematics, a practical and effective system of medicine, irrigation systems, and agricultural production techniques. The first known planked boats, Egyptian faience, and glass technology were forms of literature, and the earliest known peace treaty made with Hittites. Egypt left a lasting legacy. Its art and agriculture were widely copied, and its antiquities carried off to far corners of the world. Its monumental ruins have inspired imaginations of travelers and writers for centuries. A newfound respect for antiquities and excavations in the early modern period by Europeans and Egyptians led to scientific investigation of Egyptian civilization and great appreciation of its cultural legacy. Let's look more into the history of ancient Egyptian agriculture. The Nile has been the lifeline of its region for much of human history. The fertile flood plain of the Nile gave humans the opportunity to develop a settled agricultural economy and a more sophisticated, centralized society that became a cornerstone in history of human civilization. Nomadic modern human hunter-gatherers began living in the Nile Valley through the end of Middle Pleistocene for some 120,000 years ago. By the late Paleolithic period, and the arid climate of the northern Africa became increasingly hot and dry, forcing the populations of the area to concentrate along the river region. Well, let's look into pre-dynastic periods. In pre-dynastic and early dynastic times, the Egyptian climate was much less arid than it is today. Large regions of Egypt were covered in treed savanna and traversed by herds of grazing ungulates. Foliage and fauna were far more prolific in all environs, and the Nile region supported large populations of waterfowl. Hunting would have been common for Egyptians, and this is also the period where many animals were first domesticated. By about 5,500 BC, small tribes living in the Nile Valley had developed into a series of cultures demonstrating firm control of agriculture and animal husbandry, and identifiable by their pottery and personal items such as combs, bracelets, and beads. The largest of these early cultures in Upper Egypt was the pottery, which probably originated in the western desert. It was known for its high quality ceramics, stone tools, and its use for copper. The pottery was followed by the Armenian and the Giza culture, which brought a number of technological improvements. As early as the Nagara first period, pre-dynastic Egyptians imported obsidian from Ethiopia, used to shape blades and other objects from flakes. In Nagara the second times, early evidence exists of contact with Near East, particularly Canaan and the Byblos coast, over a period of about 1,000 years. The Nagara culture developed from a few small farming communities into a powerful civilization whose leaders were in complete control of the people and resources of the Nile Valley, establishing a power center at Nehim, and later at Abydos. Nagara III leaders expanded their control of Egypt northwards along the Nile. They also traded with Nubia to the south, the oasis of the western desert to the west, and the cultures of the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East to the east. The Nagara culture manufactured a diverse selection of material goods reflective of increasing power and wealth of elite, as well as societal personal use items. Which includes combs, small statuary, painted pottery, high quality decorative stone vases, cosmetic palettes, jewelry made of gold, lapis, and ivory. They also developed a ceramic glaze known as faience, which was used well into the Roman periods to decorate cups, amulets, and figurines. During the last pre-dynastic phase, the Nagara culture began using written symbols that eventually were developed into a full system of hieroglyphs for writing the ancient Egyptian language. Let's look into early dynastic period, 3050 to 2686 BC. The early dynastic period was approximately contemporary to the early Sumerian Akkadian civilization of Mesopotamia and of ancient Elam. The 3rd century BC's Egyptian priest Manetho grouped the long line of pharaohs from the Minis to his own time into 30 dynasties, a system still used today. He chose to begin his official history with the king named Meni, or Menes in Greek, who was believed to have united the two kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt about around 3100 BC. The transition to a unified state happened more gradually than ancient Egyptian writers represented, and there is no contemporary records of Menes. Some scholars now believe, however, that the mythical Menes may have been the pharaoh Narmer, who is depicted by wearing royal regalia on the ceremonial Narmer palette in a symbolic act of unification. In the early dynastic period, about 3150 BC, the first of the dynastic pharaohs solidified control over Lower Egypt by establishing a capital at Memphis, from which he could control the labor force and agriculture of the fertile delta region, as well as the lucrative and critical trade routes to the Levant. And the increase in power and wealth of pharaohs during the early dynastic period was reflected in their elaborate mastaba tombs and mortuary cults structures at Abydos, which were used to celebrate the deified pharaoh after his death. The strong institution of kingship developed by the pharaohs served to legitimize state control over the land, labor, and sources. that were essential to the survival and growth of ancient Egyptian civilization. Old Kingdom. Let's look into Old Kingdom. 2686 to 2181 BC. The major advances in architecture and art and technology were made during the Old Kingdom, fueled by the increased agricultural productivity and resulting population made by a well-developed central administration. Some of the ancient Egyptians' crowning achievement: the Giza Pyramids. The Great Sphinx were constructed during the Old Kingdom under the direction of the vizier. State officials collected taxes, coordinated irrigation projects to improve crop yield, drafted peasants to work on the construction projects, and established a justice system to maintain peace and order. Along with the rising importance of a central administration, arose a new class of educated scribes and officials who were granted the state by the pharaoh in payment for their services. Pharaohs also made land grants to their mortuary cults and local temples to ensure that these institutions had the resources to worship the pharaoh after his death. The scholars believe that 5 centuries of these practices slowly eroded the economic power of the pharaoh, and that the economy could no longer afford to support a large centralized administration. As the power of the pharaoh diminished, regional governors called nomarchs began to challenge the supremacy of the pharaoh. This, coupled with severe droughts between 2200 to 2150 BC, is assumed to have caused the country to enter the 140-year period of famine and strife known as the First Intermediate Period. And next we go to the First Intermediate Period. (2181 to 1991 BC). After Egypt's central government collapsed at the end of the Old Kingdom, the administration could no longer support or stabilize the country's economy, and that the regional governors could not rely on the king for help in times of crisis, and that the ensuing food shortages and political disputes escalated into famine and small-scale civil wars. Yet despite the difficult problems, local leaders, owing no tribute to the pharaoh, used their newfound independence to establish a thriving culture in the provinces, once in control of their own resources. The province became economically richer, which was demonstrated by larger and better burials among all social classes. In bursts of creativity, provincial artisans they adopted and adapted cultural motifs formerly restricted to the royalty of the Old Kingdom, and scribes developed literary styles that express the optimism and originality of the period. Free forms their loyalties to the pharaoh. Local rulers began competing with each other for territorial control and political power. By 2160 BC, the rulers of Heracleopolis controlled Lower Egypt in the north, while a rival clan based in Thebes and Inta family took under control of Upper Egypt in the south. As the Intifs grew in power, expanded their control northward. A clash between two rival dynasties became inevitable. Around 2055 BC, the northern Theban forces under the Nebuchadnezzar Mentuhotep II finally defeated the Heracleopolitan rulers, reuniting the two lands. They inaugurated a period of economic and cultural renaissance known as the Middle Kingdom, which we will look into. Now, the Middle Kingdom, 2134 BC to 1690 BC. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom restored the country's prosperity, stability, and thereby stimulating the resurgence of art, literature, and the monumental building projects. Mentuhotep II and his 11th dynasty successors ruled from Thebes, but the vizier Amenemhat I, upon assuming kingship at the beginning of the 12th dynasty, about 1985 BC, shifted the nation's capital to the city of Ichtavi, located in the Fayum. From Ichtavi, the pharaohs of the 12th dynasty undertook a far-sighted land reclamation and irrigation scheme to increase agricultural output in the region. Moreover, the military reconquered territory in Nubia that was rich in quarries and gold mines, while laborers built the defensive structure in the eastern delta called the Walls of the Ruler to defend against the foreign attack. With the pharaohs having secured military and political security and vast agricultural and mineral wealth, the nation's population, arts, and religions flourished, in contrast to elitist Old Kingdom attitudes towards the gods. And the Middle Kingdom experienced an increased expression of personal piety. Middle Kingdom literature featured sophisticated themes and characters written in a confident, eloquent style, and the relief and portrait sculptures of a period captured subtle individual details that reached new heights of technical sophistication. The last ruler of the Middle Kingdom, Amenemhat III, allowed Semitic-speaking Canaanite settlers from the Near East to the Delta region to provide sufficient labor force for his especially active mining and building campaign. These ambitious buildings and mining activities, however, combined with severe Nile floods later in his reign, strained the economy and precipitated the slow decline in the Second Intermediate period during the later 13th and 14th dynasties. During this decline, the Canaanite settlers began to seize control of the Delta region, eventually coming to power in Egypt as the Hyksos. Second Intermediate period, 1674 to 1549 BC, and the Hyksos. Around 1785 BC, as the power of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs weakened, a Western Asian people called the Hyksos had already settled in the eastern delta town of Avaris, seized control of Egypt, and forced the central government to retreat to the Thebes. The pharaoh was treated as a vassal and expected to pay tribute. And the Hyksos, foreign rulers, retained Egyptian models of government and identified as pharaohs, thus integrating Egyptian element into their culture. They and the other invaders introduced new tools of warfare into Egypt, most notably the composite bow and the horse-drawn chariot. Excuse me. After their retreat, the native Theban kings found themselves trapped between the Canaanite Hyksos ruling the north and the Hyksos Nubian allies, the Kushites. To the south of Egypt. After years of vassalage, Thebes granted enough strength to challenge the Hyksos in conflict that lasted more than 30 years until 1555 BC. The pharaohs Sekenenre, Thou II, and Kamusi were ultimately able to defeat Nubians to the south of Egypt, but failed to defeat the Hyksos. That task fell to Kamusi's successor Ahmusi I, who successfully waged a series of campaigns that permanently eradicated the Hyksos' presence in Egypt. He established a new dynasty in a new kingdom that followed. The military became a central priority for pharaohs seeking to expand Egypt's borders and attempting to gain mastery near east. The new kingdom, 1549 to 1069 BC. The new kingdom pharaohs established a period of unprecedented prosperity by securing their borders, strengthening their diplomatic ties with their neighbors, including the Mitanni Empire, Assyria, and Canaan. Military campaigns waged under Thutmose I and his grandson Thutmose III extended the influence of the pharaohs to the largest empire Egypt has ever seen. Between their reigns, Hatshepsut, a queen who established herself as a pharaoh, launched many buildings projects, including restoration of temples damaged by Hyksos, and sent trading expeditions to Punt and the Sinai. When Thutmose III died in 1425 BC, Egypt had an empire extending from Nia in the northwest, Syria, to the fourth cataract of the Nile in Nubia, cementing loyalty, so opening access to critical imports such as bronze and wood. The new kingdom pharaohs began a large-scale building campaign to promote the god Amun, whose growing cult was based in Karnak. They also constructed monuments to glorify their own achievement, both real and imagined. The Karnak Temple is the largest Egyptian temple ever built. Around 1350 BC, the stability of the new kingdom was threatened when Amenhotep IV ascended to the throne and instituted a series of radical and chaotic reforms, changing his name to Akhenaten, who he touted the previous obscure sun deity Aten as the supreme deity, and suppressed the worship of most other deities and moved the capital to the new city of Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna. He was devoted to his new religion and artistic style. After his death, the cult of the Aten was quickly abandoned and their traditional religious orders restored. The subsequent pharaohs Tutankhamun I and Horemheb worked to erase all mentions of Akhenaten's heresy, now known as the Amarna period. Around 1279 BC, Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great, ascended the throne and went on to building more temples, erect more statues and obelisks, and sire more children than any other pharaoh in history. A bold military leader, Ramses II led his army against the Hittites in the battles of Kadesh, and after fighting to a stalemate, finally agreed to the first recorded peace treaty around 1258 BC. Egypt's wealth, however, made it a tempting target for invasions, particularly by the Libyan Berbers to the west and the Sea People. A conjectured federation of seafarers from the Aegean Sea. Initially, the military was able to repel these invasions, but Egypt eventually lost control of its remaining territories, such as southern Canaan. Much of it took falling to the Assyrians. The effects of external threats were exacerbated by the internal problems such as corruption, tomb robbery, and civil unrest. After regaining their power, the high priests at the Temple of Amun in Thebes accumulated vast tract of lands and wealth, and their expanded power splintered the country during the Third Intermediate Period. This is the end of the Ancient Egypt lecture. Thank you for learning today. Have a good